Thank you, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Jamie Bennett. I'm going to read a little bit here. So Jamie Bennett is the Executive Director of ArtPlace America, a partnership among 16 foundations, 8 federal agencies, and 6 financial institutions, working to position art and culture as a core sector of community planning and development by investing in, researching, and supporting those who lead and execute creative placemaking projects. To date, ArtPlace has invested $85 million in 233 projects in communities of all sizes across the United States, in which artists and arts organizations are working with their neighbors to help shape communities' social, physical, and economic futures. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you so much. And am I talking in this one? I forget who I'm talking to. Is this good, or should I use this one? The mic. Yes, I have all the mics. I'm doing. It's election season. I can give a press conference. So it is great to be here, and really excited to have some time to spend with all of you, and especially surrounded by so much great art. And I hear there are a couple of the artists who are actually in the room. Are there people who made things that are up on view? Well, I just want to make sure I get a chance to talk with you after and take a look. So thank you very much. So I thought what I might do is talk with you a little bit about my journey to this work. Some of you are going to join us this evening at the Cultural Alliance, and I'll talk about more of some of the nuts and bolts. But I actually come from a place that's not all that far from here. I grew up about 45 minutes northeast of Scranton, Pennsylvania, in a little town called Honesdale. And Honesdale was the county seat because with 5,000 people in it, we were actually the largest town in the county. And we were a county that had more cows than people and more deer than cows. But artists were not something that I remembered having a lot of when I was growing up. In fact, the first time I remember seeing an artist, it was 3 hours away from my home when we went to New York City for my 6th birthday, and I got to see Sandy Duncan on Broadway. And I remember watching the show, Peter Pan, which was fabulous, and Mr. Belvedere starred as Nana, for anyone who's around my age. But I remember sitting there and realizing for the first time that this was an artist, right? That this was someone who was standing on stage, who was performing for an audience. And in many ways, it was that night, it was that performance that set me on my professional journey. And it was really that night that brought me years later to come to school in New York City where I studied theater. And while I was at school and studying theater, I had an opportunity in someone's senior thesis to play an Irish soldier going off to war, and I had to kiss Amanda Peet goodbye. I couldn't manage to make any of that believable, and a number of things in my life fell into place. Perhaps, most relevantly, instead of becoming a Broadway star, I became an arts administrator, right? And so today I'm lucky enough to run something that is a little bit of an odd duck. We're a 10-year fund. So we've been endowed with about $180 million, and we've been given a decade to try and get something done. And what we're trying to do, what we're working to get done, is exactly what Kelly was saying, to reposition arts and culture as a core sector of community planning and development. So I'm grateful for that night on Broadway. I'm grateful that it propelled me to where I am. But I realize in looking back, it actually taught me a wrong lesson. It taught me something incorrect, something that took about 30 years for me to figure out was wrong. That night on Broadway inadvertently taught me that artists are people who live far away. And there's something about that word artist with a capital A that many people find foreign. Right? They see the artist as other. They see the artist as someone who doesn't live in Honesdale. And it happens all across the country. A few years ago, I was actually in Aspen, Colorado at the Ideas Festival, and I was moderating this panel with Dennis Scholl, who's a vice president of arts for the Knight Foundation. And Dennis knew the audience, right? And this is Aspen, this is the Ideas Festival, so you can imagine what the audience looked like. And he turned to them at one point during the presentation and he said, I have a question. He said, who here is a tennis player? Right? You watch the hands go up and, 80% of the room said that. He said, who here is a golfer? And he looked around and just as many hands went up. But then he asked the room, who here is an artist? And no one raised their hand. Now, Dennis is a little bit like this. So he looked at them and he said, listen, I've played golf and tennis with most of you and you almost certainly have to be better artists. right? That's a funny line, but there was actually a much more serious lesson that I took from it, which is that not a single person in that audience had any difficulty taking that thing that they did badly on Saturday afternoons and putting themselves on the same continuum as Tiger Woods or Serena Williams. But none of them could take that thing that they did badly on Sunday mornings and put themselves on the same continuum as Taylor Swift, right? So the disconnect is serious and it's deep. And I actually believe it comes from the fact that not many of us know where art comes from. So a decade ago, several foundations, national foundations, got together and they commissioned some national research that found that 96% of Americans value the role of art in our lives. 96% of Americans value the role of art. 27% value artists. 96%, 27%, right? That research led to the creation of something called United States Artists, which took as its tagline, art comes from artists, right? This is a disconnect that the food world has had to deal with for a long time. When I was growing up in Pennsylvania, I thought that steak came from the A&P. I didn't realize that it had anything to do with those cows that were all around me, right? But the food world has managed to make this connection and has managed to bridge it. And today we eat local, our restaurants are farm to table, we know our farmer, we know our food. And I think that this is exactly what we have to do with artists. We have to recognize that art comes from artists. We have to recognize that artists are our neighbors. We have to understand that they live, work, and play like the rest of us. In fact, as I've been traveling the country over the last 3 years, I would argue that artists are the only asset that already exists in every community. Right? So not every community is lucky enough to have a strong system of public transportation. Not every community is anchored by a major hospital or a major university. Not every community is lucky enough to be on a beautiful waterfront. But every single community has people who sing and dance and tell stories. And so if you believe in asset-based community development, so you actually begin with your strength, we have to understand that artists have an important role to play in the world of community planning and development, and that they can help the rest of their neighbors strengthen the social, the physical, and the economic characters of our communities. So, in order to move this forward, when I was at the National Endowment for the Arts, we introduced this phrase, creative placemaking, into the national conversation. And what's been interesting to me is to pay attention to how people hear this phrase, depending on the background that they bring to it. Now, how many people here recognize Jane Jacobs? How many people have read The Death and Life of Great American Cities, right? So you all hear the placemaking half of that phrase and understand that what we're talking about is community planning and development that begins with the individual, right? It begins with the resident. It's human-centric. It's locally informed. It doesn't look the same in York as it does in Philadelphia, as it does in Chicago, as it does in Las Vegas. And it's comprehensive, right? We're dealing with all of the things that are happening in a community. We can't deal with them silo by silo. And all we're doing with the addition of the word creative is inviting our artists, is inviting our arts organizations to join their neighbors in that work. Now, for those of you who haven't read Ms. Jacobs, you may have read Richard Florida. And I was actually just in Florida with Richard Florida. And you may hear the creative half of that phrase and think that what we're talking about is an ill-formed creative class conversation, right? And an ill-formed creative class conversation goes something like this. There are 100 shiny, happy people in this country, and they are the creative class. Every mayor is in competition to get the greatest number of those people to move to her community. And whichever mayor does that wins, and as her reward, she gets a Starbucks, a bike share program, and a couple of gay people, right? And that's not the conversation that I'm looking to have, right? We're very much working in the world of Jane Jacobs. So when we think about Ms. Jacobs, when we think about the basic building blocks of community planning and development, one of the very first things that we think about are feet on the street, right? Jane Jacobs was very big on this, and she knew that positive activity on our sidewalks, positive activity on our streets, helped drive public safety. It also helped change the character of neighborhoods, their identity, what we thought was happening there, and it helped drive local economies, right? And we all know that the vast majority of art is consumed in person, in real time, and with other people, right? Which means a group of people goes somewhere and does something together, right? So if it's a theater, 500 people might walk in at 8 o'clock and walk out at 1 o'clock. If it's a museum or a gallery, 500 people might walk in and out over the course of an 8-hour day. If it's a set of rehearsal studios, people might be walking in and out every hour over the course of a 12, 14, 16, even an 18-hour day. And that begins moving people around the neighborhood, and that begins driving local economies, because you get something to eat before the show. You grab a drink after the gallery opening. You buy a ticket, a newspaper, or something on your way to rehearsal. And last year, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the US Department of Commerce that calculates gross domestic product, calculated that arts and cultural production adds $699 billion to GDP every year. $699 billion. So that is slightly larger than construction as a sector and just slightly smaller than travel and tourism. Right, so this is a major part of GDP, this 4% that is attributable to arts and culture. But now, if you've read my bio, if you've paid attention to where I come from, you know that I'm good nonprofit arts boy, right? I was trained at New York Philharmonic, I grew up at the Museum of Modern Art. But even I am the first to admit that if all you care about is foot traffic and economic impact, art and culture may not be your most efficient investment, right? If all you want is foot traffic and economic impact, you could build a soccer stadium, you could build a multimodal transit hub, and frankly, you could even put in a big box store, right? But my job, the reason I'm here doing what I do, is to make the case of why we also need arts and culture in addition to all of those other things. And I argue that it is because arts and culture does something that none of those other sectors do. And that is, arts and culture helps drive more stable communities. And it does it in 3 ways. The Knight Foundation, I mentioned Dennis Scholl, with whom I was in Aspen. They worked with Gallup, the national polling organization, right? And they were interested in investigating what are the top 3 drivers of community attachment, right? Not what makes someone move to a town, but what makes someone put down their roots and call that place their home? What makes someone become invested in their community? And they found that the top 3 drivers of community attachment across this country were social offerings, something to do, openness to new people and new ideas, and aesthetics, how things look, right? That's arts and culture. Arts and culture is rooting us in place. Arts and culture also helps attach people to people, and it does so across group identity. So there's an anthropologist at the Field Museum in Chicago called Alika Wally, and Dr. Wally studied people who do art together, people who perform in drumming circles, sing in church choirs, are in book groups, are in sewing circles, perform in community theater. And she actually discovered that arts participation acts as a master identity, an identity that transcends age, race, ethnicity, country of origin, gender, socioeconomic status. People who do art together create bonds that are durable and last beyond the art experience itself. And finally, civic engagement. People who participate in arts and culture are more likely to participate in activities beyond the arts. We vote at higher rates, we volunteer at higher rates. So if you take those 3 things together, if you take community attachment, if you take social cohesion, and if you take civic engagement, those are the ingredients of a more stable community. So if the artists are there already, the artists are already in place in every one of our communities, they can do some of the basic community planning and development 101, driving foot traffic and spurring the local economy, and they can do something that no one else can do, create more stable communities through community attachment, social cohesion, and civic engagement. Why not include us in community planning and development? Now, I want to go back to this phrase for a second, given the group that we are assembled, and talk about one of the other things that this phrase creative placemaking does, right? So when I was working at the National Endowment for the Arts, I was lucky enough to work for a chairman called Rocco Landesman, and he knew that most of the time when we begin talking as an arts and culture nonprofit sector, We begin by talking about the thing that we don't have, right? Which is money. We begin by talking about our scarcity, about our lack, right? And so that's not a very powerful way or a very inviting way to begin a conversation, and it's not a very powerful position from which to start a partnership, right? Because the conversation is, I don't have any money, you have some money, could I have some money, please? And that's not very powerful. But he knew that that wasn't true, and that didn't actually reflect what his lived experience was, that there are very real ways in which arts and culture contribute to their community. And this didn't really hit me until 2 years ago when I was in Sauk County, Wisconsin, for an amazing thing called the Farm Art Detour. And essentially what this does is it takes a 50-mile circuit in rural Wisconsin, and it gets the artists together with the farmers, together with the local businesses, and they create a 2-week celebration of everything that's happening in Sauk County. So artists do major installations of art. Farmers put shapes and farm forms and mazes in the field. People make pies and sell beer. People make instruments and perform and do everything. And so the idea is that you show up and you drive this 50-mile circuit. And I moved to New York when I was 18, so I've never owned a car. So the thought of spending a Saturday afternoon driving around beautiful Wisconsin was just sort of delicious to me, especially the fact that I could crank up the radio, right? And because God has a sense of humor, God decided to make it NPR Pledge Drive Week. So I was driving around listening to the Pledge Drive, but all of a sudden I heard Garrison Keillor come on, and Garrison Keillor began talking about fundraising in a language that I hadn't experienced, right? Rather than talking about it in a beggar's posture, he talked about fundraising as an exchange of value between two entities, each of which had something the other needs, right? And that's exactly what this phrase creative placemaking is supposed to do, right? It's not ask what you can do for the arts, it's to ask what the arts can do for our country. So, let me talk you through about how this works in practice. And I brought a couple examples with me just to show you what this looks like on the ground when artists join in their other neighbors. So, this is a picture of Main Street in Little Rock, Arkansas, right? And the mayor, who I was just with in Miami at this City Lab conference, had a sort of moribund Main Street, right? He had a Main Street that once was literally the heart and soul of that community, but over the years had been hollowed out and not a lot was happening. And one of the things that had happened as part of that hollowing out is that the symphony, the ballet, and the theater all moved away from Main Street and moved out to various satellite locations. So the mayor said, I've got a vacant downtown where I need stuff happening. You three are extraordinary arts organizations that have been doing good work. Would you like to have a new home in the center of town? And the only thing I want in return for that is I want you to make your first floor in some way permeable, right? So the symphony decided to put speakers on the outside of the building so that when you're walking down the street, you could listen to them rehearse. The ballet invested in portable bars. So on nice days, they take ballet class outside at 11 a.m. And the theater installed a bar in a restaurant that was open even when the theater wasn't open. So all of a sudden, the mayor began clustering this activity, began putting these organizations next to each other. Not one of them had to change what they were doing, they just changed where they did it. And now Little Rock is on its way to reclaiming what historically had been its Main Street, that it really was the gathering place for that community. In a different example, on the drive over, Kelly was asking if I had a favorite project. This is probably the one I talk about most as a favorite project. Do folks know Tacoma Park, Maryland? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a first-ring suburb of Washington, D.C., right? So what that means is that thousands of people live in Tacoma Park, and millions of people want to spend as little time as possible there, right? Because it's just between them and work. And over the past 50 years, every single decision about the built environment in Tacoma Park has been made for the people who want to spend as little time as possible there, right? Streets have been widened, stop signs have been taken out, speed limits have been raised, so people can just blow through town as quickly as possible. So a group of citizens got together and said, well, what about those of us who are deeply rooted here? What about those of us who call this our home? What about us? So they decided to reimagine New Hampshire Avenue, which was a main drag in Tacoma Park. And Dance Exchange, which is a local dance company founded by Liz Lerman, decided to partner with the local Tacoma Park Department of Transportation, and together they decided to reimagine this avenue. right? Their theory was the traffic engineers think about bodies moving through space, but they tend to only think about vehicular bodies, right? And they tend to only think about efficiency. How quickly can I get how many cars through here in as little time as possible? But dance makers, dancers, choreographers think about bodies moving through space, but they think about the human body, and they tend to think about the quality of that experience, right? How does a human move through the space, and what are they experiencing as they do it? So they got together, and if they brought together those kinds of knowledge, the traffic engineer knowledge and the choreographer's knowledge, they could design a street that takes into account the cars and the people. And it takes into the account the needs of an 8-year-old going down the street and an 80-year-old going down the street. And that by working with their other neighbors, they could design a better product. In Ashland, Massachusetts, suburban Massachusetts, there's a former EPA Superfund site that was created by a chemical dye company, right? So for years, this company was pumping poisonous chemical dyes into the ground. So that stopped. The EPA has been reclaiming it. And as part of that effort, a local artist, Dan Borelli, has planted a polychromatic garden on top of the EPA Superfund site. So the very same colors that are in the soil polluting it are now in the flowers that are on top of it, both making the problem visible so it's something the community can address, and also actually taking the poison out of the dirt. So the red flowers are taking the red poison out of the dirt. And I think this is one of the most elegant, most beautiful projects that we've seen, and it's continuing to happen. And then the last project I wanted to talk about, given the fact that a fairly major event is happening in 2 weeks, I thought I would talk about electoral politics, because that's always a safe topic, right? This is not federal, don't worry. So the city of Austin, Texas, historically had at-large city council representation, right? So you could live anywhere in Austin and represent all of Austin. And they looked and realized that over the last 50 years, 80% of the city council members had come from the same 2 districts, which meant that 80% of that community was being represented by people who had never lived or worked in those neighborhoods. So they decided to move to district-based representation. So you have to live in the district in order to represent the district. And as part of that, they went through a redistricting process, right? And as we all know, redistricting processes always make total sense, reflect the way we live our lives, right? No. This was the most fakakta gerrymandered system you've ever seen. And so what the city did as part of that is the city's Department of Economic Development actually hired 10 artists and asked each artist to go out and map one of the newly drawn council districts. Get to know the people and use their photography to tell that story. Get to know the buildings and the businesses and use theater to perform that. Get to know the issues and the concerns and use spoken word or poetry. And they did this for 2 reasons, right? The first was to create a sense of shared identity among this group of people who had just been thrown together and told that they were District 1, right? They actually wanted to create some sense of them knowing each other, and to create a more responsive government, right? So that when you were elected city council member for District 1, you were not generically in charge of the district, you're in charge of Mrs. Jones and her dog and the pothole and the library. And so you actually begin knowing it. So artists as a driver of a more responsive system of government is sort of what I keep holding on for the next 2 weeks as I think about what happens. So that is sort of a whirlwind introduction to sort of my arrival at this work, to some of the kinds of projects that we funded. And I'd love to sort of take the balance of the time we have left. Someone will let me know how we are on time. But to hear about what's happening here in York, to hear about bright spots and things I should know, to take questions, to hear people's disagreements, or just to sort of enter into conversation with any of you. So I'm going to pause there and